Looking back at this week, I tell myself we are better than this. We are all better than this. And I just want to get that out there. We all witnessed what happened last week, and we witnessed yet again more fracture lines that reveal themselves among the people. First, I want to know if you are okay. And if you are not, or not yet, I hope that we can work this through together. There are many questions that need answers. This is what I know, that knowledge and faith are power. That knowledge and faith give us power. And this calls to mind another quote by Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love." If we can try to understand what happened last week and why, in the light of love and power and justice, then I believe we can begin to heal. And if we don't try, then our bodies and souls are going to remain as fractured as our nation. My first question is, how can anyone make meaning out of this rampage? I know historians and social scientists and politicians of every affiliation are going to be trying to do just that for years to come. But you know what? We should too, because it reflects on all of us. And that's what this morning is all about. I'm talking about soul searching instead of searching for everyone to blame and punishing them. We saw a violent and failed attempt to steal our election, our legitimate Republican and Democratic and independent votes. The crowd that spawned it had gathered outside for hours, wandering around and even posing next to a scaffold and a noose. We didn't find out about the guns and the zip ties and the pipe bombs until later. But how painfully familiar those scenes must have been to all who remember the unholy glee of lynch mobs. These people were met by a police force that did not see the danger until it was too late. They didn't recognize the rage behind the smiling faces that were so like their own. Instead, they thought they were there to placate protesters and minimize damage. And at the end of the day, 5 people were dead, and a new line in the sand was drawn. And on one side of their line are the people who were horrified, and on the other side of the line are the people who were delighted. On the one side are those who thought it was useless, and on the other side are those who thought it was necessary. Where do we go from here? What do we do next? We don't even agree on the meaning of what we saw. And I think it's because we truly don't have a common ethical language. You see, the rioters have a completely different frame of reference from their critics. They don't understand it. And I can't help but thinking, can people be evil who do not know that what they do is evil? That's a good question. And I'm not sure I have the answer right now. The right of peaceful protest is protected by our society, albeit in principle rather than practice. But we also know that the possibility of violent protest often follows the peaceful protest. But getting aside from their actions, I want to ask, what is at the root of it all? And I have to tell you, there's a big lie at work, but it's inside an even bigger lie. The big lie is that the election was stolen. The recounts by ordinary workers, people like us, our neighbors, proved it was not. The state courts refused to overturn the election. The Supreme Court refused to overturn the election. There was no reason to do it, no matter what those advocating overturning the election said. We try to be a country of laws and not reckless and abusive demands. But why do so many people believe otherwise? And I think the answer to that is the bigger lie. It is the lie that whites, and I say that in question marks and quotation marks, are superior and deserve to hold power and privilege over those who are not white. And this nation is facing the natural consequences of its legacy of white supremacy and extremism. And I'm afraid that this is what the future holds for us and our children if they are left unchecked. Now, I applaud our legislators for returning to their chambers and ultimately carrying out the will of the people. And I grieve the loss of life, so wanton and so pointless. I know that the assault would never have made a difference to divided public opinion or to the outcome of the election, or most importantly, to the truth. It was violent posturing for social media and a tragedy fed by monumental egos, outright lies, and deadly irresponsibility. And I am glad that our legislators rose above their shock. Can you imagine what that day must have been like? That they rose above it, exhausted, not sure what was going to happen next, and yet they still did their duty. And it is up to us to do the same. Since June, and actually for some times before June, we have been on a journey together to address racial disparity. And we have been on a journey together to understand violence against Blacks primarily, but also violence against Indigenous people and people of color and women and children and anything other than white. A group of us are standing vigil, going from once a day to once a week. We'll probably return to once a day when it gets warmer and lighter. But we've also been talking about what we can do as a community. And that means we've been talking about what we can do about ourselves. We are at a turning point in our faith, in our community, and in our country. And it is time that we recognized and took responsibility for our long, long history of assaulting the democracy that we praise. Yesterday morning, when the group was meeting, Deanne reminded us that this country was founded on a terrible, terrible contradiction, an ennobling belief in democracy and a degrading belief in white superiority. So yes, it has been there with us from the beginning. If we want to understand how and why this evolved, if we want to understand how we are connected to this, if we want to help stop the violence, then we have to understand whiteness, understand whiteness before we can undo its grip on ourselves and on our nation. I want to say that those rioters betrayed us, but the truth is that we've been on this path. We have been on this path, and they were just another step on the journey. And it has got to stop. Just stop. We are better than this. We are better than our history. We have to be. We have to be. So what is whiteness? I'm using that term. And whiteness is different from the color of skin. Whiteness is a status of power that accrues to some people with a kind of a color of skin. The label of whiteness means something when you're trying to figure out who's higher up on the mythical and social food chain. The notion of whiteness is connected to people who think that the fittest, the whitest and the fittest have to be in charge. It's not a generalization that all whites are equal or all whites are the same. Excuse me, all Americans of Northern European extraction, except maybe the Irish, or maybe yes to the Irish, but oh, maybe to the Italians, since they're all descended from those noble Roman-looking antecedents. And maybe the Spanish, but only the ones from Spain. And the noble Greeks, of course, and maybe some more Southern Europeans, but not Eastern Europeans or the Jews, unless they're lighter ones, if you know what I mean. In other words, this image and concept of whiteness is shifting constantly. And why does it do that? Because it is a lie. It is a fiction. It is and never was a biological fact. It is and never was an indication of the quality of the worth of someone who has white skin. Here's how Paul Keeble defines it. He is a white, widely known violence prevention educator and author. And he says, racism is based on this concept of whiteness, a powerful fiction enforced by power and violence. Whiteness is a constantly shifting boundary separating those who are entitled to have certain privileges from those who are not, whose exploitation and vulnerability to violence is justified because they are not white. That's what whiteness is. And here's how Ta-Nehisi Coates defines it. Coates is a Black journalist and author. And he writes, Americans believe in the reality of race as a defined, indubitable feature of the natural world. And racism, the need to ascribe bone-deep features to people and then humiliate, reduce, and destroy them, inevitably follows from this unalterable condition. I don't want this condition to be inalterable. Not anymore. We have inherited this kind of mindset. It's not something that we chose. It's something that we were taught to believe, and something that involuntarily commands us to act on. Whiteness conveys full humanity on someone depending on how they appear. And without whiteness, an individual is considered less than a full human. I mean, think about it. Think about the cartoons you watched as you grew up. Think about the illustrations in your books. Think about the movies that you saw. Think about the way you have seen people treated in the media. It's the notion that the size of the skull, the height of the forehead, the shape of the eyes, the prominence of the nose, the width of the lips, the color of the skin, the texture of the hair and the hairline, the height, the weight, the musculature, the sex, the country of origin. I could go on and on and on, but these characteristics, according to whiteness, convey the character, the intelligence, the worth and integrity, the capacities and the rights of a human being. And whiteness goes further to define someone who is non-white as a potential danger and a challenge to the social order of things. It has always been the bigger lie. It has never been real. It has never been true. And it has never been necessary. It would never have been necessary if we were willing to make sacrifices of our power for the common good. But this bigger lie has been passed down to us from our culture for centuries. And the sole reason for it to exist is to justify violence. Violence needed to strip others of power and ultimately of life, so that those who consider themselves white can gather more power. Whiteness is a fiction that sustains the seizure of power by force. It is not the moral, but the immoral justification. And one of the reasons that are cited is that idea of survival of the fittest, that civilization is going to fall apart if whites are not in charge of things because whites are the fittest. This idea has sustained the powerful and those who want to be powerful for centuries. And when a big chunk of the population, white and non-white alike, will point out how ridiculous this fiction is, then that power will begin slowly but inevitably to crumble. So of course, since we've started doing this, more lies and wilder and more desperate lies are necessary to prop up privileges, as we saw this past week, and we have been seeing for years, for centuries. but it is so deeply embedded in white perceptions of how the world is supposed to work and where they and we fit into the scheme of things that we can't even see clearly enough to unlearn them unless the stakes are high enough. And I think maybe the stakes began to be high enough this past week. From the cradle, whites have been inundated with racist images and inoculated against the pain that they cause others. This is whiteness. It is the privilege to not know what is going on. But at the same time, that means that it is a prison, cutting white people off from the reality of the world and all of the pain of the world and all of the possibilities of the world. Whiteness stunts our growth to be real and capable and honorable human beings instead of being enclosed and defined by this circle of dominion. And I wanted to find out where that notion of survival of the fittest even came from anyway. Because when you talk to white supremacists, a lot of them believe it. And that's something we see a lot of nowadays, kind of made up or mistaken quotes that lend a dubious mantle of authority to the bigger lie. It's almost like radicals who quote scripture to let them do what their fundamental principles would deny them. So who mentioned first the survival of the fittest? I'm betting you thought it was Charles Darwin, but it wasn't. It was Herbert Spencer. Now, Spencer was a British philosopher who came up with the notion of social Darwinism literally 7 years before Darwin himself published his book, The Origin of the Species. And if Spencer had waited, he might have learned something from Darwin, because Darwin's theory of evolution and the survival of our communities and our civilization didn't depend on the survival of the fittest. Darwin said it depended upon kindness and communal cooperation rather than strength and domination. The evolution of the species, suggested Darwin, was linked to our growing capacity for compassion and concern for others, for strangers, and all sentient beings. I want us to think a little bit about what a world without whiteness might look like. And I would be interested in hearing your thoughts. A group of us watched a short film the other day that featured an interview with Layla Saad, who wrote a book that I am enjoying very much called Me and White Supremacy. And during that interview, she said, I deserve to live in a world where I am treated like a whole human being, of service and not a servant, to be treated like a whole human being, of service and not a servant. We all deserve that. We all deserve to live in that world. And we have to create the society that makes that possible. In a society that we create to take care of all our basic needs and the needs of the earth that sustains us. That is ultimately on us. We need to create a culture that is not conserved, where power is not conserved, where power is released to support our purposes of peace. There's so many things that would look so different in that world. First of all, we'd see a lot more people of color living in our communities, and think of naming rights. People would be able to choose their own rights and know that people could pronounce them. Think of the naming of places. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we lived in towns and communities whose names we inherited from 10,000 years ago from the First Nations that were there, instead of the name of the person who just laid claim to it? What would we have to give up to get to a world without whiteness? We would have to give up our comfort. We would have to give up the way that we assign status and reward achievement. We would have to give up all of the familiar milestones that lead our lives right now. We would have to offer salvation to all, not just to those who believed a particular thing. We would have to sacrifice righteousness. The list could go on, but I know that my time is near. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how do we end whiteness in ourselves. It's going to start with self-examination, deep, in-depth, and somewhat painful self-examination. But we can support each other. It can be supported by the leaders around us and our companions. And during this process, the further we get into it, the more that we will be able to dismantle that prison that we created. This is going to require training and discipline. I want you to think of a marathon that we will be on for the rest of our life, because it will never end. Now, right now, as some of our commentators were talking about last week, now is the beginning of the end. I think they were thinking of democracy. Or the end of the beginning of the assault. So I want you to think about, how do we unlearn whiteness? How do we reach for a world without it? And let us help each other take the next step. Thank you for listening.